happened to date and project forward what's likely to happen, so that we can start taking action in advance of the consequences that are going to follow. We get ahead of, or at least get a handle on a crisis when we can use the best information we've got in order to make projections of where we're going. A third kind of situational awareness that we need could be called situational analysis. As the situation develops, we want to compare what we expected to happen with what's actually happening, and do that systematically, not haphazardly, because if things develop in a different way than we expect, then there may be something different going on. We have a failure of information, and we've missed a piece of the puzzle that would let us be better prepared. So we also have to be very self-consciously checking what happens against what we expected, and assimilating any differences into our understanding of what's going on and our ability to plan our actions looking forward with event. And finally, we have to be able to take action that's customized and suited to the conditions we're actually facing. We need to be able to design operational plans that respond to the distinct features of the emergency we face, and to make sure that those plans, that we're not locked into rigid plans. One criticism of China's improved emergency planning that a number of Chinese academics have made is that they have developed extremely detailed contingency plans for different ministries and for a very long list of crises. And because they have a system of strict accountability for results in China, sometimes it is safer for a subordinate official, when confronted with an emergency, to implement the plan, even though that official is aware that there's something that is wrong with what the plan says, given the circumstances that they face. Because it is, some people allege, safer to say, I did what the plan said and it didn't work, in which case you're not responsible for the failure, the people who wrote the plan are, than it is to say, I didn't do what's in the plan, and I didn't improvise because of some changed conditions, and therefore, but if what you did doesn't work out well, you may be accused of deviating from the plan and be held responsible for failure. So there can be a rigidity that is introduced into planning that requires you to be watching what's actually developing in the situation and seeing where you need to revise your action planning. One way of illustrating the difficulty of getting situational awareness is to think about, again using my model of severity against time, to think about what happens in the early hours of a disaster. The conditions at the scene are likely to be either start out very bad or very rapidly get quite bad. The people who respond are likely to lag in their beginning of understanding from the time the disaster started. There's going to be a gap. And they're likely not to keep up with the development of events for all the reasons that we talked about. As a result of that, there's going to be a gap between what they understand and what's actually happening in the world. One of our objectives should be to reduce that gap by having good devices for getting situational awareness. One other thing that links up to the issue of communication that several of you raised this morning is that even when responders start to learn something about the situation, they may be slow to let other people know what is happening, and therefore the situational awareness of people away from the scene of the events may be much poorer than it needs to be. We're all very conscious of trying to reach out and gather information that somebody else might have that we need. We don't think as often, especially when we're operating under pressure, of saying, what do I know that might be useful to somebody else? And yet during disasters, you may know something that would be extremely useful, even life-saving to other people. And developing systems that allow information to be shared readily, quickly, and transparently can be very crucial. Let me pause here, too, if anyone would like to make comments or... since time is close, I will not leave that invitation lying around for long. The fourth problem I want to highlight is one that I think got mentioned this morning, where you were taking steps to address this. And I certainly don't know enough about Indonesia to know whether that's adequate addressing yet or not. But one of the features of a disaster is that lots of responders come together at the scene of a disaster or in the emergency operations center of a government. In that case, they come together around a table like this one. And these may be people who are not used to dealing with each other. They may have met each other at big meetings. They might know each other's names. Maybe they don't. They may be quite inexperienced in dealing with each other. If you're at the scene of the disaster, there will be many people who show up and who are unknown to each other. The extreme example of that is likely to be a forest fire, which typically happen in areas where there are very few people, and yet you may need tens of thousands of people to fight a big forest fire. So all those people come from someplace else. They come together, and they have to operate in a coherent way, both to get the work done and to protect themselves and each other from being harmed by the emergency operations, which is quite easy to do in an event like a forest fire or extracting people from collapsed buildings or whatever is the action. What makes this problem harder is not just that these are people who don't know each other, but they come from different professions, and they may have vocabularies that are different, that are tied into their technical knowledge. Think, as you looked at the slide presentations this morning, how many acronyms there were that started flying by. If I was in a situation where I didn't know many of the acronyms, but perhaps some of you were unfamiliar with the terminology that was being used in those slides. Under emergency circumstances, that can lead to bad mistakes. It can lead to danger for responders. Different jurisdictions will come together. People from one community and another community, or one province and another province, come together. They may never have operated together. Levels of government have to cooperate, and there will be private sector organizations, companies, etc., NGOs, as was mentioned this morning, various kinds of not-for-profit groups, and in most countries, volunteers will start to show up. All of those people are going to be interacting with each other. They can either do productive work, or they can cause chaos and endanger each other. Being ready to manage the large number of individuals who come together is a crucial element. In the U.S., we have developed an operating system that tries to standardize the method of operation in disasters. China is beginning to experiment with doing this, although they're not as far along. In our case, it started in the wildland fire or forest fire business because of this obvious need that I just mentioned. It is called the Incident Management System or Incident Command System, and it essentially is an organizational template that allows response organizations to have a set of roles and responsibilities, a common vocabulary for dealing with the emergency, a structure for relating different organization roles to each other, a system of authority and decision-making. It doesn't do the decision-making, it doesn't exercise authority, but it creates a template that people can adopt and should adopt on the scene, and that gets people past the point of saying, who are you, what are you supposed to do? Instead, you introduce yourself and say, I'm the head of the planning section. I deal with planning for medical care to responders who are hurt. And so there's a specific role. Everybody knows what that person does. Everybody knows how they relate to other people. And personnel are trained to understand those roles, understand the structure of decision-making. And usually in the U.S., there are elite teams of managers of these large responses that might, as I say, involve over 10,000 people. They are specialists who have had lots of experiences at running these kinds